I just wanted to give a quick content warning before we get started. This episode contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing themes. Listener discretion is advised. That's why we mark the true crime explicit.
I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome back to another bone-chilling Stab and Gab Sunday on the Lurk podcast, where I dive deep into the darkest corners of true crime, stab at the gruesome details, and gab about the mysteries that keep us up at night. For those of you who are new, I'm Jamie, your solo guide through the shadows, and today we're traveling to 1922, Bavaria, Germany, to a remote farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, for a case that's as brutal as it is baffling. Hinterkaifeck is not the name of a town. It's the name of the farm built in 1863. Hinter, in German, means behind, and Kaifeck is the name of a village, so in effect it means behind Kaifeck, specifically 1 mile north of the village of Kaifeck, bordered by dense forest 40 miles north of Munich. Picture a snowy, isolated farm, strange noises in the attic, footprints in the snow that lead nowhere, and a creeping sense of dread. This is the kind of story that makes you check under the bed before you go to sleep at night. We're going to talk about the Hinterkaifeck murders. 6 people murdered, a family and their maid, savagely bludgeoned to death, a killer who might have lived in the house for days afterward, and a mystery that's never been solved. So grab your coffee, maybe a flashlight, and a blankie for comfort, and let's get lurking. It's 1922, and Germany is reeling from the aftermath of World War I, which ended just 4 years earlier. The economy is in shambles, inflation is skyrocketing, and rural areas like Bavaria are hit hard. Bavaria was the founding region of the Nazi Party, which grew significantly in 1921 to 1922, due, in part, to the frustration over Germany's growing economic problems. This is a place of hard labor, small communities, and deep superstitions where tales of ghosts and curses are as common as the morning mist. Life here is tough. Farmers, like the Grubers, work from dawn to dusk, and the isolation of a place like Hinterkaifeck can amplify tensions. Grudges, secrets, and old wounds fester in the quiet. At the heart of this tragedy are the 6 souls who lived and died at Hinterkaifeck. Let's meet the Gruber family and their maid, a group with complex dynamics and plenty of local gossip swirling around them. Andreas Gruber, 63, was the patriarch, a grizzled farmer who'd spent his life working the land. He was known for being extremely brutal to his wife and kids, and was quick to attack people with dangerous objects like a scythe, pitchfork, or shotgun. His wife, Cecilia Gruber, was 72, the quiet backbone of the family. She was tough, used to decades of hard labor. Imagine hauling water, cooking for a crowd, and keeping the household together. Age was catching up with her, and she relied heavily on her daughter to pick up the slack. That daughter was Gruber-Gabriel, 35, a widow and the family's shining star. Victoria was beautiful, with a voice that carried through the church choir, and she had a charm that made her stand out in their small community. But her life was far from easy. We'll get to that in just a moment. Her husband, Gruber-Gabriel, was presumed killed in World War I, leaving her to raise 2 children alone. Her children were Cecilia Gabriel, 7, and Gruber-Gabriel, too. Both lived with her and her parents at Hinterkaifeck. Little Cecilia, who went by Celie, was a bright light, loved by her teachers for her curiosity and infectious smile. She'd trudge through the snow to school, always eager to learn. Joseph, the toddler, was still in diapers, a chubby-cheeked kid who clung to his mom and his grandmother. And finally, there was Maria Baumgartner, the 44-year-old maid who arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the day of the murders, March 31st, 1922, to start her new job. Maria was a widow, hard-working, and had no known ties to the family's drama. She'd taken the job to support herself, likely expecting a quiet life of scrubbing floors and feeding livestock. Instead, she stepped into a slaughterhouse. Let me be frank and say this was not the picture-perfect family. Andreas was not well liked and was, basically, a monster. He was controlling and abusive and suspected of fathering his grandson and possibly his granddaughter. Yes, you heard me correctly. Around 1915, Andreas was caught by a servant forcing himself on his daughter Victoria. It was undoubtedly not the first time this happened. The servant went to the police. Though Victoria was a victim, the town convicted both her and her father, Andreas, for incest. Victoria spent a month in jail for her involvement, though let me stress that she was a victim and not a willing participant. Andreas received only a year in jail and returned to the farm in 1916, and he continued to abuse his daughter. Victoria made many attempts to get away from her abusive father. In 1914, she married a local man, Gruber-Gabriel, but the ever-controlling Andreas forced them to live at the farm. Tragically, Carl was declared missing in action in 1914 and presumed dead, though his body was not recovered. In 1915, Victoria gave birth to her daughters, Celie, and yes, there was a question about who actually fathered little Celie. Victoria then started having an affair with a neighboring farmer named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. When Lorenz's wife died, he then asked for Victoria's hand in marriage. However, in 1918, Victoria became pregnant again, and Lorenz was adamant that he was not the father. Lorenz confronted Andreas because we all know he was most likely the father, and Andreas threatened Lorenz with a scythe. Lorenz broke off the engagement and in 1919 reported Andreas for incest. Lorenz eventually retracted the claim and did claim paternity of Joseph, even paying support, but it was done at Victoria's insistence, and he never truly accepted the paternity. All this basically made the family social pariahs. Locals whispered about Victoria's love life and Andreas's harsh ways, but no one could have imagined the horror that was coming. Strange things began happening about 6 months prior to the murders. Krizen's Rieger, the family maid, abruptly quit. She had been complaining of strange noises coming from the house attic. She tried to persuade Andreas to check out what could be causing the noises, and she was fueled by an overwhelming sense of dread. But Andreas refused and downplayed her concerns. So fearing the house was haunted by something evil, Krizen's quit and left the farm. Around mid-March, Andreas starts telling neighbors he's hearing footsteps in the attic at night. Heavy, deliberate steps, not just the house settling. He checks the attic, but it's empty. No dust was disturbed, and there were no signs of anyone. Just days before the murder, Andreas notices footprints in the snow outside, leading from the woods to the farm, but there were no footprints leading back to the woods. The prints led to a door to the farm's machine room, and the lock there had scratchings on it as though someone had tried to pick the lock. It gets stranger. A key to the house goes missing, and Andreas finds a newspaper from Munich in the living room. a paper that nobody in the family recognizes. He initially thought perhaps the postman had left it behind, but that wasn't the case. Victoria, who was the most likely to read, swore that it wasn't hers. No one in the town subscribed to that paper. Little Cecilia, the 7-year-old, told a school friend she was scared because her grandpa kept hearing noises. A neighbor, Michael Plotke, said Andreas confided in him about seeing a strange figure in the woods near the farm, but when he called out, it disappeared. Andreas reported these omens to the local police in Weithofen, but this was a small rural force in 1922. They dismissed it as the wind or a prank. If they'd taken him seriously, maybe things would have turned out differently. On March 31st, little Celie was falling asleep in class, and when asked what was wrong, she told her teacher that the night before, her mother Victoria and her grandfather Andreas had gotten into an ugly fight where her mother was hit by her grandfather. Victoria fled the house and ran into the woods and was missing for hours. The family searched for hours and finally found her slumped on an old tree stump. Later that same day in the afternoon, a new maid arrived at the house. Maria Baumgartner was escorted to her new job by her sister, who left the farm after a brief stay to see that her sister was settled. It's believed that Maria Baumgartner's sister was the last person to see the Gruber family alive, except, of course, for the killer. The night of March 31st, 1922, is when the horror unfolds. Based on what investigators pieced together, the killer, or killers, lured 4 victims to the barn, one by one. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia. Each was bludgeoned with a pickaxe-like tool. The blows were precise and devastating, mostly to the head, skulls shattered, faces unrecognizable. The bodies were stacked in the barn and covered with hay, as if the killer wanted to delay discovery. Back in the house, the toddler, Josef, and the maid, Maria, were both killed. Josef was struck in the crib, a single blow to the head, and Maria was found in her small room, with her skull caved in. Blood splattered the walls, the floors, even the ceiling, a silent testament to the violence. For days after the murder, neighbors saw smoke rising from the chimney, as if someone was still living there. On April 1st, the day after the murders, 2 men arrived at Hinterkaifeck. They were Hans and Eduard Skorowski, coffee sellers who were there to take orders, as they had done before. They knocked on the door to the house, but didn't receive an answer. They knocked on the window, but still had no response, so the 2 men went out into the yard, but found no one about, and they left. The only thing they noticed was that the gate to the machine house was open, but they suspected nothing amiss. The school little Celie attended became aware of her absence without an excuse the next few days, and people noticed that the family failed to show up at church for Sunday worship. On the morning of April 4th, local mechanic Albert Hoffner arrived at the farm to repair an engine. Upon arriving, he didn't see anyone, and no one answered the door. He said he heard nothing except the sounds of the farm animals and the howling of the family dog inside the barn. Albert waited for an hour for Andreas to show, and then decided to start his repairs without him. The repair took about 4.5 hours, and during that time he saw no one. Later that same day, on April 4th, at around 3:30 p.m., Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Victoria's former fiancé, sent his 16-year-old son Johann and his stepson Josef, who was 9 years old, to Hinterkaifeck farmstead to see if they could find the whereabouts of the Gruber family. The 2 boys eventually returned home and said they had seen no one at the farm. Schlittenbauer headed to the farm himself, along with Michael Pohl and Jakob Siegel. The 3 men entered the barn, and there they found the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and Celie. Lorenz Schlittenbauer then went into the house alone and found the bodies of the maid, Maria Baumgartner, and little Josef. The case was given to Inspector Georg Reingruber and his department. The investigation was hampered because someone, most likely the murderer, had been in the crime scene. Investigators found the kitchen in disarray: bread eaten, meat sliced from the pantry, a bowl of soup half finished. The family's dog was tied up but fed, and the cattle were all cared for. A calendar on the wall showed the date for April 1st, 1922. Because it was determined the family was killed on March 31st, this meant that someone, most likely the murderer, had torn off the page for March 31st. The killer had stayed in the house, eating, sleeping, and acting like they owned the place. That level of audacity, it's like they were daring the world to catch them. The investigation was a disaster, but let's hear from the witnesses who tried to make sense of it. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor and rumored lover of Victoria, was one of the first to raise the alarm. He told police he got worried when the Grubers didn't show up in town for days. Lorenz's behavior raises eyebrows. He was oddly calm, searching the house before police arrived, and some locals overheard him say, "I guess they got what they deserved." He had motive: the issue over little Josef's paternity, the broken engagement, the accusation by Lorenz that Andreas had fathered Josef, and the ensuing argument. He also had a financial dispute with Andreas over land. Michael Plocke, a local farmer, confirmed Andreas's stories about the attic noises and footprints, saying Andreas seemed genuinely rattled. Crescenz Rieger, the ex-maid, doubled down on her haunted claims, describing nights where she heard whispers and footsteps that stopped when she lit a lamp. A butcher named Hans Ritter told police he'd seen a stranger near the farm a week before the murders, a tall man in dark clothes, but his description was too vague to be useful. April 5th, the day after the bodies were discovered, court physician Johann Allmuller performed the autopsies on the victims in the barn. He found that the most likely murder weapon was a type of tool shaped like a pickaxe, with an adze-like arch blade on one side and a pick on the other. The victims suffered horrendous injuries. Cecilia Gruber was found to have 8 holes in the right side of her skull, while her daughter Victoria's skull had 9 holes after being repeatedly hit on the right side of her head. There was also allegedly strangulation marks found on Victoria's neck. The most heartbreaking was little Celie. She had 1 hole on the right side of her face. She had also suffered a smashed jaw when the killer used an iron band, later found in the hayloft, to silence her. The fatal wound was done with a penknife, which was used to slit her throat. She was found half naked, something most likely done by the killer. One of the worst things found was that little Celie did not die right away. She laid there dying and pulling clumps of her own hair out of her scalp. I wanted to point something out. Pulling out your hair is called trichotillomania, which is a mental health condition that can be caused by many factors, to include genetic issues, DNA mutation, or in children, it is sometimes caused by trauma. I think this was already a coping mechanism Celie had, and that is beyond heartbreaking to imagine what things that little girl went through in her young life. Interesting to note that Andreas had different wounds. He died from a fall into the tip of a heavy pickaxe, which was found in the animal feeding trough. This wound tore open his carotid artery, and he bled to death in a short time. He only had this one injury. The killer had partially hidden the bodies by covering them with hay and a wooden door. Inside the house, Maria, the maid, suffered injuries to the face on the right side of the head and died from 1 hole to the top of her skull. Little Josef was killed while he slept in his bassinet. He died from a single powerful blow to the right side of the skull. The skulls of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for further examination. One bizarre piece of information stated that the victims' skulls were sent to a clairvoyant in Munich for readings, but they were lost and never returned. The police botched the investigation from the start. They didn't secure the crime scene, letting neighbors trample through and contaminate evidence. The murder weapon was not immediately found at the scene, and there were no fingerprints taken. Police began questioning witnesses. Farmer and butcher Simon Reiselander claimed that while he was on his way home near Brunnen on April 1st at 3 a.m., he saw two mysterious figures at the edge of the forest. When the strangers saw him, they turned around so that their faces could not be seen. Later, when he heard of the murders, he thought it was possible these strangers might be involved. The motive for the crime was first thought to be robbery, so the police interrogated vagrants, traveling craftsmen, and several nearby inhabitants. Michael Policki, a local artisan, passed by the Gruber home on the night of the murders. He said that he saw that the oven had been heated by someone. He said someone approached him with a lantern that blinded him, and he quickly went on his way. Policki said he also noticed that the smoke from the fireplace had a revolting smell that reminded him of burning rags. This was never followed up on, and no one ever investigated what might have been burning in the fireplace. The robbery theory was eventually dismissed when a large amount of money was found in the house. From the evidence, it was clear that the killer had remained at the farm for several days because someone had been feeding the cattle, consumed an entire supply of bread from the kitchen, and had recently cut meat from the pantry. Over 100 people were questioned, locals, vagrants, even a traveling circus performer, but no solid suspect emerged. At the time, investigators believed that the family had been lured to the barn by screams, until it was determined that human screams, at least, could not be heard from the house. Less than a year after the murders, the house and barn were demolished, and during the demolition, the murder weapon was found. A handmade mattock, crafted by Andreas Gruber for killing cattle. Also found in the attic was an area where someone had been living. Carpet had been laid down to muffle footsteps, and there was hay for bedding and even a pile of human poop. The case went cold, and it stayed that way for over a century. All right, lurkers, it's time for Stab and Gab, where I slice into the grisly details and chew on the theories that keep this case alive. There were a few potential suspects on the investigators' radar. One of the first suggested suspects was Gruber-Gabriel, the husband of the widowed Victoria. Though he was reported as killed by a shell attack in France in December of 1914, Carl's body was never recovered. Shortly after the murders, people began to speculate about whether or not he had actually been killed. His wife, Victoria, conceived little Joseph after her husband's presumed death, which gave a motive. However, there were witnesses that said they were present at the shell attack and saw Gruber-Gabriel die. Another excellent suspect is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Lorenz was the person who discovered the bodies, and there was also the issue of Joseph's paternity. Speculation of Lorenz's involvement began early in the investigation. Locals pointed to his strange behavior after the discovery of the bodies. When Schlittenbauer arrived to investigate where the Grubers were, along with his two friends, the three men had to break a gate to enter the barn because all of the doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the four bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer apparently unlocked the door to the house with a key and suspiciously entered the house alone. There he discovered the bodies of the maid and Joseph Gabriel. You'll remember, a key to the house had previously disappeared. It is possible that because Lorenz Schlittenbauer was a neighbor and one time romantically involved with Victoria, he might have been given a key. When asked why he went in the house alone when it was unknown if the killer was still there, Lorenz said he went to look for his son Joseph. While in the Gruber house, it is known that Schlittenbauer disturbed the bodies at the crime scene in a way that might compromise the investigation. For many years after the murders, Schlittenbauer remained the center of local suspicion because of his strange comments. After the farmhouse and barn were completely destroyed, a local teacher, Hans Blager, discovered Schlittenbauer visiting the remains of the demolished farm, and when asked why he was there, Schlittenbauer said that the murderer's attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn had been hindered by the frozen ground. This strange statement was considered evidence that Lorenz Schlittenbauer had intimate knowledge of the condition at the time of the murders. But because he was a neighbor and also familiar with the local land, he could have been making an educated guess as to why the bodies were left stacked. Before his death in 1941, Lorenz Schlittenbauer initiated and won several civil claims of slander against those people who described him as the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. The defense against slander is the truth. The former maid, Crescens Rieger, gave the names of several suspects. She believed a local man who had helped with potato harvest at the farm was the killer. The man, Anton Bichler, was familiar with the farm. Rieger believed Anton Bichler and his brother Karl carried out the crime. Rieger said that Anton often talked to her about the Gruber and Gabriel family and suggested that the family ought to be dead. The former maid also said in her interrogation that the family dog who barked at everyone never barked at Anton. She also reported speaking to a stranger through her window one night. She said she thought it was Karl Bichler, Anton's brother, who had no reason to be at the farm so late at night. She told police she thought Anton and Karl could have committed the murder together with Georg Siegel, who had also worked at Hinterkaifeck and knew the family was wealthy. Siegel had broken into the house in November of 1920 and stole a number of items, though he denied this. When questioned, Siegel said that he had carved the handle of the murder weapon when he was working at Hinterkaifeck and knew that the tool would have been kept in the barn passage. Crescens Rieger also made statements about the Thaler brothers. The brothers had already been known to have committed several minor burglaries in the area prior to the murders, and Crescens said that Josef Thaler stood at her window at night and asked her questions about the family, though she never gave him any answer. In Josef Thaler's conversations with the former maid Crescens, he allegedly claimed to know which family member was sleeping in which room, and said they had a lot of money hidden in the house. Crescens noted that there was another person nearby while the conversation was going on, but she could not identify the other person. Several years later, in the middle of May 1927, a stranger stopped a resident of Vadhofen around midnight, asking questions about the murders, before shouting that he was the murderer. The stranger then ran into the woods and was never identified. The murders are chillingly methodical. The mattock was a heavy, awkward tool, yet the killer landed precise, devastating blows, mostly to the head. That suggests strength, maybe even familiarity with farm work, and a cold-blooded focus. Luring the victims to the barn one by one? That's not random, it's predatory, like the killer knew their routines. Why the barn? Maybe to muffle the screams or because it was a place of significance to the killer. And the fact that little Cecilia survived for hours, suffering in the hay, it's heartbreaking and infuriating. Then there's the aftermath. The killer stayed in the house, eating bread, slicing meat, feeding the animals. That's either ice-cold confidence or someone who felt at home. I can't decide what's creepier, a stranger making themselves cozy or a neighbor acting like nothing happened. It's like they were taunting the universe, daring someone to walk in. Now let's gab about the theories, because this case is a true crime buffet. Theory 1. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor. He had motive. Rumors say he was Victoria's lover, possibly Josef's father, and the Grubers shut that down, causing a rift. He also had a financial dispute with Andreas. His behavior after the murders is suspect. Searching the house, acting calm, and that they got what they deserved comment? Shady. But his alibi held up, and there's no direct evidence tying him to the crime. Still, he's a fan favorite for armchair detectives. Theory 2, Gruber-Gabriel, Victoria's supposedly dead husband. He was reported killed in World War I, but some locals swore they saw him after in 1918. Could he have survived, returned, and snapped over family drama, maybe jealousy or betrayal? It's a long shot, but the idea of a ghostly soldier seeking revenge is straight out of a thriller. The problem? No proof that he was alive, and it doesn't explain the killer's post-murder domesticity. Theory 3. A random drifter or serial killer. Hinterkaifeck's isolation made it an easy target, and 1920s Germany had its share of vagrants and criminals. But why stay in the house afterward? That feels personal, not opportunistic. Plus, the precision of the murders suggests someone who knew the farm's layout. Plus, there was a whole lot of money left in the house. And then there's the paranormal angle. Locals called Hinterkaifeck cursed, and Kresen's story of ghostly voices didn't help. Some even tied the murders to the strange newspaper or the attic noises, like a spirit was involved. I'm not saying it was a demon with a mattock, but in a case this weird, you can't entirely dismiss the spooky stuff. There's also the lesser-known theory, a local with a hidden grudge. The Grubers weren't exactly beloved. Andreas was prickly, and Victoria's rumored affairs stirred up jealousy. Maybe it was someone who blended into the community, someone the police overlooked because they seemed normal. The mattock, the luring, the staying afterward, it feels like a crime of rage, not robbery. My take? It's kind of hard to pin down. There is one theory about Andreas Gruber that I lean towards in my gut. This theory suggests that Andreas was the murderer. This would explain why and how the murderer remained on the farm after the murders, carrying out chores and even the task of changing the calendar. He basically would have had nowhere else to go. After April 1st, there were no other eyewitness accounts of signs that someone was living at the farm. Everyone just assumed that the murderer stayed in the house for 3 days, but I think Andreas died on April 1st, and I think it's possible that Lorenz Schlittenbauer killed him. Because of remarks made by Lorenz, it seems that he was actually the father of Victoria's little son Josef, not her father Andreas. Andreas was known to be violent to his daughter, and it was believed he would have beaten her if he learned the true parentage of Josef. In fact, you'll recall, Celie told her teacher that her grandfather had beaten her mother, who ran off, just the night before the murders took place. Victoria once told Lorenz Schlittenbauer, "That's the better thing, that I'm pregnant by father, otherwise he would beat me to death." It's believed Victoria was allowed to be with other men only because she was already pregnant by her father, unable for someone else to impregnate her. It is possible that when Andreas learned Josef was Lorenz's actual son, he flew into a rage, killing his family. Remember, Victoria was strangled as well as bludgeoned, so there was a personal component to her death. But I'm going to throw another scenario in the mix. Remember that little Celie was found half naked, and her grandfather Andreas was already raping her mother. So it isn't a stretch to think he had started to move onto his granddaughter. It's possible that something was going on in the barn with Andreas and little Celie, and Victoria, along with her mother, attempted to intervene. So he killed them, and Celie, and because he killed them, he would need to kill the maid as well as Josef. But what happened to Andreas? Remember, he was not bludgeoned like the others. He had fallen, or was pushed, onto a pickaxe, and the injury he sustained severed his carotid and he bled out. I think it's possible either Lorenz Schlittenbauer went to the house, discovered the murders, and took care of Andreas. He knew details about the murder that no one else did, including knowing the murderer tried to bury the bodies. Or it was a divine intervention and a happy accident that Andreas tripped and caused his own death. But this case is like a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and every theory has holes. Who was up in the attic? Was it an intruder living there? Or was it a hiding place for members of the family to try and get away from Andreas? And honestly, I'm still not sold Lorenz didn't do it. The murder case was officially closed in 1955, with no charges ever being brought against anyone. So what do you think, lurkers? Was it a scorned lover, a ghost, or something we haven't even considered yet? Hit me up on the social media, dying to hear your wildest theories. That's it for this episode, the Hinterkaifeck murders, a century-old mystery that's still as haunting as ever. 6 lives snuffed out, a killer who vanished into the Bavarian woods, and a farm that locals still whisper about. We may never know the truth, but cases like this are why we're obsessed with true crime. The stories that linger, the questions that claw at us in the dark. Before I sign off, a massive thank you for joining me on this dark journey. If you love this episode, head over to lurkpodcast.com where you can find links to our social media. Follow us on X, Instagram, and Facebook for behind-the-scenes content and case discussions. Check out our blog for deeper dives into the cases we cover, and sign up for our monthly newsletter to stay in the loop on new episodes and exclusive goodies. Got a case you want me to tackle on Stab and Gab Sunday? Drop it in the comments or shoot me a DM. I'm always hunting for the next chilling story. And if you're enjoying Lurk, do me a solid and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other true crime fans find us and keeps the Lurk community growing. Tell your friends, your coworkers, even the barista at your coffee shop. Spread the word about Lurk. And until next time, keep lurking.